So they can make executive decisions.
Our first speaker is Chad Pecknold. I'll take that as a cue with all the usual subtlety that Chad Pecknold provides that we can begin our conversation today. My name is Michael Buddy. I am professor of Catholic Studies and Political Science here at DePaul University. I'm also a fellow in the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our conversation this afternoon on civil religion, national myths, Catholicity, and a variety of sort of questions. We're quite pleased to have two interesting and important scholars with us today. I'll tell you a bit about each of them first, and then invite them to share some remarks with us. Our first guest is Martin Menke. Martin did his doctoral work at Boston College. He is an expert in the Catholic Church and politics during the Third Reich era in Germany. He's written a number of interesting and I think important journal contributions that are helping to reframe some of the questions about the role of the not only the hierarchy and congregational leaders in German Catholicism, but also some of the still controversial questions ranging from the role of the German Center Party and some of the difficult issues about citizenship, obligation, and the faith in those particular contexts. He teaches history at Rivier College in New Hampshire, and we're quite pleased to have him with us today. Our second speaker is Jakelic, who is a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study of Culture at the University of Virginia. There's a northeastern connection here. Apparently, beyond this panel, with the exception of the moderator, you have to have done doctoral work in Boston. So, Slava did her doctoral work at Boston University. She's edited a number of different books dealing with questions of identity and modernity. She's the director of the Institute's project on secularism in the late modern age. She has a recently completed book on collectivistic religions, and she's bringing a variety of interesting and important questions to bear in the sometimes edifying and sometimes frustrating area of sociology and religion. So, thank you for joining us today. Ask Martin to share some thoughts with us first, and then Slava, and then we'll open for conversation and questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really been, I think, a great conference to be at. I was particularly, I think, stimulated this morning by Father Katungala's work on northern Uganda, because one of the things he talks about is the importance of region, which is something that German historians have rediscovered. Cecilia Applegate has wrote a huge book on Heimat, which is the German version of your Paese or your pays, as the Frenchmen would call it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how your region can influence your nationalist views, if you're a Catholic, of your neighbors. So that's what I'm going to do. So in recent years, historians have rediscovered the role of religion in what we once thought was the triumph of secularism, and we are beginning, I think, to have a much better sense of the importance of the tension between national identity and religious identity. Many historians who at one point assumed that religion was irrelevant to events after the French Revolution have rediscovered religion as a social, cultural, and political force in the 19th and 20th century. Much better so far in the 19th century. Helmut Walser-Smith is leading the charge there, but there are a number of others, Barbara Stambulis in Germany. But I think that we're finally moving into the 20th century, which I think we've ignored because of Nazism and communism. So my question then is, furthermore, the question of the faith's persistence and development in 2 centuries dominated by nationalism and Marxism, I think, offers new insights into both the transcendent faith and material ideologies. Finally, I think this work is relevant to us today because early 21st century events continue to remind us of the importance of religion's relation to politics, be it in the form of claims of American exceptionalism or Muslim fundamentalism. So in the latter half of the 19th century, Europeans promoted the nation-state as the natural form of political organization. But even while the nation-state achieved paradigmatic status, which is, by the way, it's still taught in America's secondary schools, it was always a questionable construct, I would argue. First of all, not only did other state forms exist, think of Austria-Hungary or Switzerland or Belgium, but defining what the heck one of these nations is proved extremely difficult. One need there only think of the efforts to establish new Central European nation-states in the wake of the First World War, which proved disastrous largely because these efforts ignored religious and regional identities, which in Europe, I think, play a crucial role in defining who you are. So ask an Irishman who he is, and he'll probably include his home county. An Italian will identify more closely with Paese than with Italia. A German definitely talks about Heimat, and you can classify Germans within about 50 miles the minute they open their mouth. And a Frenchman's pays, as Jürgen Weber always said, it was much more important, and really people didn't start speaking a French language until the 1920s. So by analyzing, in this particular case today, the relationship of Rhenish Catholic Germans, folks on the western frontier, and Upper Silesian Catholics in the eastern frontier of Germany, during the years between the two world wars, and by contrasting this relationship with the way German Catholics overall looked at French and Poles, I think we come to a more differentiated understanding of identity formation among German Catholics. Namely, that regional identity constitutes an important qualifier to both national and religious identities and their role in understanding one's neighbors across national frontiers. Furthermore, by analyzing these three different layers of identity, universal, national, and regional, you see that those wishing to emphasize regional identity by demarcating it from national identity are able to rely on the universal identity of the Church to defend their regional interests. In the case under consideration, at the end of the First World War, German Catholics overall initially harbored strong resentment against their French and Polish neighbors, even though both France and Poland were predominantly Catholic countries. While in Germany, in fact, Catholics only made up a third of the population, concentrated mostly in Bavaria and the south, where people aren't really sure that they're Germans, and along the two frontiers in the east and the west, divided by a solidly Protestant center. So after, however, the invasion of Germany's industrial heartland in 1923, and faced with the failure of what I call Germany's self-victimizing insistence on France's moral wrongs, one of the leaders of German political Catholicism says, we'll get along fine with the French as soon as they've gone to confession. Rhenish Catholics developed the ideals of a new Occidental Christendom as the framework within which to achieve Franco-German peace and cooperation. Catholics of the Franco-German border region argued that Europe as a whole depended on the spiritual and intellectual welfare of both countries, achieved only on the basis of shared Christian values. They believed that the speedy evacuation of occupied territories in the West ought not only to occur to liberate Germans, but also as a step towards the realization of this new European Occidental ideal. And I would argue that by the end of Weimar, folks in the West had a lasting Christian commitment to a greater Europe. By contrast, despite the efforts of some German Catholics and Upper Silesians to adjust to changing conditions, Poland on Germany's eastern frontier was never to become part of a German Catholic vision for a new Europe. To understand the nature of the relationship between German Catholics and their co-believers on either side of their borders, I think it's necessary to remind ourselves of the situation this young new German state faced in 1919. Both France and Poland were hostile neighbors. In the West, the French government was bound and determined to prevent any future threat from Germany and restore to itself Alsace and Lorraine, taking the Tsar as a League of Nations mandate, and by occupying German territory west of the Rhine River. In the East, the new Polish state, resurrected after more than a century, was insecure about its boundaries on all sides and about the significant ethnic and religious minorities within these boundaries. Both during the early years of the Weimar Republic and even as late as early 1933, there were fears of a Polish invasion, capitalizing on German weakness. From Germany, Poland had gained the former Prussian province of Posen, as well as the important port city of Danzig, both with mixed ethnic identities, Posen more Polish, Danzig more German. For German Catholics, the territorial losses in foreign occupation represented a particularly heavy burden, as the frontier regions affected, the Rhineland and Upper Silesia, were predominantly Catholic. The fate of the Germans in these occupied territories was of special concern to the bishops and to the Centre Party, which despite declining numbers still considered itself to represent German Catholicism at state and national levels. And I would argue the Centre Party consciously saw its role not just in the defense of Catholic interests, which we would call Catholic politics, but in the introduction to the larger political arena of policies based on principles of Catholic teaching, which we call political Catholicism. So in the years after 1919, German Catholics saw themselves as an aggrieved party, victims of an immoral peace that not only violated Christian norms of decency, but also violated the ideals underlying Wilson's 14 points, on which Germans had pinned such high hopes for a just peace. Germans believed that, like all the other European nations, they had the right to an all-encompassing ethnic German state. Matthias Erzberger, one of the most ardent advocates of peace since 1917, declared, quote, "We are a community of faith, which hard suffering has welded together in national unity. One day this unity will encompass also those German tribes not yet part of us. What has been given to Poles and Czechs, French and Italians, South Slavs and Romanians, Latvians and Lithuanians cannot be denied to Germany. All Germany must come together." So that's our starting point. During the following years in the mid-20s, before the paralysis of the world economic crisis, these attitudes, however, changed dramatically to calls of cooperation, particularly those of Nächstenliebe, the love of your fellow, the love of the one next to you, the love of your neighbor, embodied in an ideal of European Occidentalism. Whereas French Catholics initially were assumed to be more interested in justice for past German sins than in reconciliation. However, Catholics by the late 1920s argued that Catholics across Europe must unite to preserve the spiritual supremacy of Europe and to replace the idol of nationalism. And there's some nascent anti-Americanism in there as well, we're seeing sort of American capitalist materialism. In this dramatic reorientation of larger German Catholicism, Catholics in the Rhineland led the way. To judge by their publications and public pronouncements, the dramatic change was limited, however, towards attitudes towards France. Poland would remain the enemy. During the first 4 years of the Weimar Republic, German Catholics struggled against both French separatist efforts in the west and Polish efforts to gain Upper Silesia in the east. The Centre Party, Germany's political Catholic voice, claimed that instead of reconciliation, France seeks to enslave Germany, la haine emporte tout. Hate prevails over everything. At this stage, German Catholics remained convinced that the ultimate goal of France's policy was the destruction of Germany. But worst of all was the damage the French government's anti-German policies were doing to Europe as a whole. France wanted to destroy Germany, even, quote, at the price of an accelerating moral and political and economic dissolution of Europe. The French occupation of 1923 of the Ruhr area is devoid of culture, devoid of morality, and constitutes the psychologically greatest threat to the future of Europe. Whether Europe lives or dies now lies in France's hands. Europe needed France, but it also needed Germany. Of this, German Catholics were convinced. Unfortunately, German Catholics long time believed it was their French co-believers who had to first seek forgiveness. Only the near collapse of both German and French economies in the fall of 23, the introduction of the Dawes Plan in 24, and the preparatory work of the Locarno Agreement in 25 provided the ground on which German Catholics could consider Franco-German cooperation. As early as 23, Catholics acknowledged that the serious problems confronting the two nations could be solved only in a European context. Franco-German cooperation was a prerequisite for mutual recovery. France will have to recognize once and for all, the papers said, that it must renounce its plans for German dismemberment if the state of war, latent or open, between the two countries is to end. France must seek its own peace within the framework of a European peace. Germans and French have no other choice but to live with one another or to perish together. Now, the most important, enthusiastic supporters of this new vision were the folks in the Rhineland themselves. They understood the need to come to some sort of practical solution with their neighbors across the Rhine, and yet there was the beginning of something more than simply pragmatism. in the concrete dangers in which they found themselves, they decided that they had to lay a more lasting foundation for improved relations. The leader of this movement at that time was a man whose political career gained a national dimension during the post-war occupation of the Rhineland, Cologne's Lord Mayor, and post-war Germany's first Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer. As early as 22, Adenauer, addressing the German Catholic Convention, issued a public appeal to French Catholics to seek reconciliation and cooperation on the basis of their shared faith. In this context, then, he and other Rhenish leaders met with the national government in January of 29 to discuss the future of the French-occupied Rhineland and to deal with the very serious starvation and hunger going on in the region. The goal of the meeting was for Rhenish and national leaders to find a common position in dealing with French authorities. Adenauer and the Rhinelanders demanded that the national government concede the formation of a Western German state within the federal structure of the Reich and other guarantees to meet France's security needs. Even if such measures weren't really desirable, it was necessary to placate France, and without them Germany might disintegrate and at the very least would lose the Rhineland. Since the previous September, they noted, when the national government had ended the support for the resistance to the French occupation, Rhinelanders had been struggling without clear guidance from Berlin and felt themselves sacrificed in favor of national interests. The foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann, rejected Adenauer's suggestion out of hand and argued that he must continue to conduct a foreign policy based on disregard for the people as long as national interests demanded it. This Rhenish Catholics could not accept. And perhaps the most prominent Catholic advocate, and certainly most prolific publisher in this area, was Hermann Platz, who was professor of Romance languages at Bonn University. He edited and founded a journal called Abendland, or Occident, whose programmatic title spoke volumes about the vision for Europe's future. For example, he argued that Germany, France, and the idea of the Occident was a clear indication of the future of Europe. Laden with the pathos typical of the time, he argued that the Rhine was primeval German soil, urdeutscher Boden, but there was something else which overarches the fatherland, and that is the Occident. There was a need for a return to Christian roots of the Occident and its values, forgotten by contemporary politicians on both sides. The idea of national mission, which has such devastating effects, must recede in favor of the idea of service. Europe will be renewed by the idea of the Occident if only we Occidentals become conscious of our common heritage, our overarching ideals, our ways of thinking and feeling, which have formed close relations and friendships among us. The future of Europe lay in a renewed Christianity hearkening back to the days of Charlemagne's great Christian empire spanning the Rhine. His vision, however, was already not all-encompassing. For example, in his Occident, there was no room for atheist Russia, nor was there room for Britain with its overseas empire, which really robbed it of its right to call itself a European nation. He also lost no lines talking about the needs of German Catholics elsewhere in Germany. While Platz might be dismissed as on the intellectual or academic fringes of German Catholicism, other Rhenish Catholics who advocated reconciliation with France occupied leading political roles in German political life. One of these was Joseph Jost, a Catholic labor leader born in Colmar in Alsace, and thus intimately familiar with the problems of Franco-German relations. He actively promoted cross-border cooperation and frequently addressed groups in both Germany and France about their common responsibility for Europe's future. At one point, the German embassy in Paris complains about all these folks, these Germans coming to France all the time wanting to speak to somebody. By the mid-20s, the Rhenish Center Party had convinced most of the national leadership to espouse Franco-German reconciliation as a necessary step towards the recovery of Europe, as a guarantee for the future stability of Europe, and ultimately as a Catholic moral imperative. In the annual Civic Guide for German Catholics, the Politische Jahrbuch, in 1925, Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, canon lawyer from French-occupied Trier, argued first for an international order based on Christian ethical values. A year later, he described Franco-German cooperation as the necessary basis of such a European peace. And as late as 1930, the Center Party's press service welcomed the participation of Alsatians at the biennial German Catholic Convention in Freiburg in southwestern Germany. The press service noticed that while Alsatians had become loyal French citizens, Catholicism knew no national boundaries. They were ethnically German, patriotically French, and spiritually European, which must mean Christian. In 1930, Adenauer and other Catholic leaders joined the board of German-French Society to express their support for cooperation. Rhinelanders who experienced French occupation at close quarters were thus the strongest advocates of cooperation with Germany's western neighbors, and the idealistic and moral basis to achieve this was the universal values of the Church. But as long as Weimar democracy persisted, cooperation with France remained an existing imperative for German Catholics, but that never developed in regard to Germany's eastern neighbor, Poland. Here the moral imperative was consistently outweighed by national interests. The national government supported Upper Silesians only as long as Upper Silesian interests served those of the national government. Here too, however, local representatives of the Catholic population were often much more interested in cooperation, or at least with acknowledging differences, than was the national leadership of German Catholicism. Silesia had been under German princes' control since 1143. For centuries had been part of the Habsburg domains, and Frederick the Great had taken it from the War of Austrian Succession in 1748. So after the auspicious beginning during the reign of Frederick, however, the rise of Protestant-dominated German nationalism as a Prussian government policy in the 19th century forced on the province an increasing Germanification, a policy similar to the forced Polonization after the war. To achieve Wilsonian ethnic self-determination of the region, under the provisions of the Versailles Treaty, there was to be a plebiscite in the easternmost parts of Silesia, Upper Silesia. Residents were to be asked whether they wished to remain with Germany or join the new Polish state. In the propaganda war which preceded the plebiscite, a conflict which 3 times turned bloody as well, the Upper Silesian branch of the German Catholic Party played an important role. Even more than in the Rhineland, the Upper Silesian Center was characterized by the regional identities of its members. Upper Silesians first and foremost identified themselves as Upper Silesians rather than as simply only Germans or Poles. They had come to resent the Prussian state and its discrimination, but 60% would eventually vote to stay with Germany in the plebiscite. In fact, the region was thoroughly bicultural and bilingual. German speakers were easily identifiable as Silesians because of their strong regional accents and dialect, and the Poles spoke a dialect of Polish called Wasserpolnisch, which was difficult for most Poles to understand. In fact, one could argue that Upper Silesian identity was an identity sui generis, neither German nor Polish, but also not German and not Polish either. Above all, Upper Silesians would tell you they're Catholic. Before 1918, German Catholicism had supported the interests of the Polish minority to protect Polish language schools and news media, and particularly the right to hear Polish sermons and sing Polish hymns in Mass, which the Prussian authorities had tried to stop. Once German defeat and the reestablishment of the Polish state created a new situation, German Catholicism shifted its attitude. Now the rhetoric, political rhetoric in particular, became largely anti-Polish. During the struggle for Upper Silesia, German Catholics emphasized the fundamentally German nature of the region and decried Polish-sponsored insurrections, which were aided and abetted by the French commander of the plebiscite forces. In confidential cabinet discussions after the Rapallo Agreement, where it was negotiated between Germany and Soviet Russia in 1922, Reich Chancellor Joseph Wirth, a very liberal, committed Democratic Republican Catholic, explained that really there's no reason for Poland to exist, and that one should not exclude force as a means to revise Germany's eastern frontier. So that gives you our starting point. By 1922, no German Catholic could imagine, however, such a response in the West. By 1922, nobody was talking about taking back Eupen-Malmedy and Alsace-Lorraine. It just was out of the picture. Over the course of the next few years, once it became clear that Poland would not disappear, German Catholic attitudes shifted, particularly after the coup d'etat by Marshal Pilsudski led to a stabilization of Polish politics. The motive, however, for improved Polish-German relations always remained utilitarian, and the ultimate goal always remained the revision of the borders. First, one could not only wait for Poland to collapse, one would have to do something in the meantime. Secondly, the German minority in Poland need to be protected. And third, German security interests in the East had to be met, about which the German government was very concerned. And eventually there would be a border revision in which one would then again have a larger Polish minority, which one would then be compelled to treat well. Even a relative pacifist, like the Jesuit Hanan Mukamin, argued that the reason to strive for Polish understanding was to someday achieve a revision of the borders and to have influence in Poland to protect the German minority. Again, as in the Rhineland, the impetus for change on the national level stemmed from an initiative on the local level in the border regions where needs were most pressing. One of the loudest advocates of achieving some understanding with Poland was Silesian Center Party leader Monsignor Ulicka, described by the Nazis as the uncrowned king of Upper Silesia. Ulicka was one of the few who admitted that there might possibly be some commonalities with Polish Catholics. In a 1928 speech before the Reichstag, he argued that Germany should pursue a constructive, neighborly relationship with Poland, and that Germany had legitimate cultural and economic interests in the survival and stability of the Polish state. Better than some of his colleagues, I think, Ulicka understood that in the European constellation of states which arose from the ashes of the First World War, the nation-state could no longer be absolute. Rejecting Wilhelmine glorification of the state as an organic entity, Ulicka argued that, quote, the state serves the human being in its full development. This was in keeping with New Catholic teaching. Benedict XV in 1920 had proclaimed that the gospel has not one law of charity for individuals and another for states and nations, which are indeed nothing but collections of individuals, and that people must treat one another across state borders as if they were individuals. Thus, Ulicka believed himself in keeping with Catholic teaching when he rejected irredentism and argued that states with large minorities had to show some sensitivity for the outrage members of these nations might feel at perceived injustice of their partition from the mother country. Nonetheless, in principled matters of faith, he warned national identity could not supersede the need to serve the faithful in their own language and culture. The Catholic bishop of the region, Adolf Cardinal Bertram of Breslau, demanded that his priests continue to be able to serve people of both cultures. They had to be proficient in both German and Polish to graduate the seminary so that they could hear confessions and provide spiritual instruction. Bertram called on all dioceses of all backgrounds to avoid strife and focus on religious beliefs. He urged Catholics to moderate national differences and obstacles. Nobody may reprimand you for loving your ethnic ways and your language. Language and ethnic ways are gifts given to us by God through nature. Whether you are German, Polish, Czech, Moravian, or Wendish, cultivate love for your maternal language and its uses. But far from us be national hatred and antipathy. He insisted that politics and differences about the future state organization of Silesia be carried out outside the church. But Bertram always believed in obeying legitimate state authority. He's the only German bishop to celebrate a requiem for Hitler in May 45. Right? That's how far he goes. A year later, Bertram again reminded his flock of its Christian responsibilities. It is God's commandment to treat all with love and justice without exception, regardless to which tribe and language they belong. Grant to each the care of his particular language and customs. He forbade priests not incarnated in his diocese from hearing confessions or preaching. Political activity by non-incarnated clergy would lead to immediate suspension. He would not permit clergy from outside the diocese, by which he really meant Polish clergy, to influence the plebiscite vote or the Polish minority. For him, the free exercise of faith had to trump all other considerations. Once the Allies split the province, he called on the faithful to bear this heavy burden in complete accord with Catholic teaching, obedience to legitimate state authority, and trust in the state's goodwill. Grant equal love, equal justice, equal consideration for fellow Catholics of both languages. We may love our language with warm devotion stemming from our mother's breasts and voice, but higher than this love, however, is the demand for the love of any Christian, which he owes his brothers and sisters. For Bertram, serving the nation meant serving God through culture and faith, not through the exacerbation of ethnic and political differences. In his region, principled resentment of all things Polish would have made life very difficult for the faithful within parishes. Indeed, would have denied some of the faithful access to the sacraments, compared with which danger maintaining national identity and pride failed. At a convention of French and German Catholics in Berlin in 1930, to which Poles were not invited, Ulicka came closer than any other center party politician to acknowledging a moral imperative for cooperation with Poland. He conceded that many Poles were inspired by a sense of national responsibility for the protection of the Occident, and that some, in his own parish and home region, might acknowledge that the distinction between Germans and Poles was frequently arbitrary, and that such a region could spearhead Polish-German cooperation. But this was not to be. The economic crisis of the early 30s, Polish-German relations deteriorated, and then the Nazi regime immediately ended all efforts of cooperation with the Poles, and in fact banned Ulicka from the region. It would take a catastrophe beyond imagining, and until the 1960s, for German-Polish reconciliation to resume in earnest. Thus, neither the National Center Party nor local Catholic leaders in Silesia ever sought true reconciliation with Poland based on a common identity. Ulicka himself doubted that after 150 years of foreign domination, Poles were capable of responsible civic engagement, either within their country or in the international community. So there was no talk about any kind of shared culture, shared European Occidental mission. Now, and there's a whole bunch of arguments why this might be. Fundamentally, I believe this simply has mostly to do with the fact that French were Catholic co-religionists, while the Poles were seen primarily as Slavs. So you have a strong ethnic dislike. In the case of Wild and others, there's a strong disdain for Poland and even enmity. There are few references to common Catholic values. In the West, the only instance of racism we see concerned the presence of French and U.S. and African and American, French and U.S. African and African American forces in the occupied territory. In fact, ethnic Germans organized a rally in Madison Square Garden in 1922 in support of throwing out any colored troops out of Germany serving in French and American forces in Europe. In the Polish case, one can only come to the conclusion that deep-seated prejudices, one need only think of the derogatory term polnische Wirtschaft, a completely mismanaged household or business, against the Slavic neighbors outweighed any Catholic commonalities. Where in the Catholic case, religious commonalities, questionable given France's level of secularization and Mova's nationalization of religion, outweighed national differences. In the Polish case, national differences outweighed religion. The French were Occidental Europeans, the Poles were Slavs. But when post-45 integration began, it again would begin in the West. It began based on the formative experience of Rhinelanders and others who were born in and had grown up in border regions. And I point really quickly here, Alcide de Gasperi for Italy had sat in the last Austro-Hungarian parliament. Robert Schumann had been an Alsatian lieutenant in the Kaiser's army in the First War and the French resistance in the Second. And Adenauer himself was no great fan of what he called the Russian superstate. So these men, I think, were ideally focused on, and they all shared their Catholicism, ideally chosen to begin European post-war reconciliation. But it would be a socialist, Willy Brandt, who initiated the lasting rapprochement between Poles and Germans in the late 1960s, and who negotiated the acknowledgement of Germany's eastern frontier established after 1945. Perhaps if Catholics of the interwar period had been more willing, and perhaps even more able to see greater commonalities with their Polish neighbors, then that second partition of Silesia in 1945 along the Lausitz-Neisse might not have come to pass. As Thomas Kamuzella has shown, today's Upper Silesians again seek to capitalize on their regional identity, to explore their discrimination during the years of communist rule, and on their special, particularly economic connection with Germany. Today, the European Union is in large part a union of regions, encouraging the development of cross-border regional cooperative ventures, many of which benefit Germany's western and eastern frontiers. Thus, I think it is wise for us to explore elsewhere and deeper the effect of religious identity not only on national identity, but also on regional identities as a means of better understanding the multiple layers of identity and the tensions between them. Thank you.
started the conference. It has become commonplace to perceive the link between Catholicism and group identities as a problem. There are, in my view, two main arguments for this. One more theological, and the other more historical and sociological. First, it is suggested that Catholicism, which constitutes some group's identity, in the process necessarily loses its universality and its orientation towards transcendence. In relation to group identities, especially nationalism, Catholicism, it is argued, becomes appropriated for particularistic, this-worldly, most often narrow political goals. Take, for example, the interpretation of the role of Catholicism in the Bosnian and Croatian wars. Miroslav Volf, a distinguished theologian and the author of the books Exclusion and Embrace and The End of Memory, Remembering Rightly in a Violent World, declared that all religions, Catholicism included, had a very particular role in the Bosnian Croatian wars. They served, he said, as a cultural resource rather than an active faith. Instead of being the origin of religious behavior, Catholicism in Bosnia and Croatia were the connection between fundamentalism and nationalism. Very similar thinking made the Croatian scholar of religion, Željko Mardešić, who is himself a devout Catholic, to write that the only way out of the vicious circle, as he put it, in which Catholicism and other religions fall into worldly traps, is the faith that is not historically grounded, but rather founded in the personhood of every human being. So the first argument against the link between Catholicism and group identities stems from the notion that the true Catholicism, the true Catholic faith, as opposed to Catholicism as just a mere cultural resource, is something that emerges from the sincere beliefs and personal dedication to universal tenets of Catholic teaching. History, particularities, and embeddedness in international culture, we are told, in a long run, become an obstacle for being truly Catholic. The second, more historical and sociological critique of the link between Catholicism and group identities is manifested in the meanings and the uses of the notion of religious nationalism. Take, for instance, the Polish case. For many observers, internal and external, the Catholic radio station Radio Maria is considered as equally problematic for Polish democracy and Polish Catholicism because of what is seen as xenophobic and radical religious nationalism. In Bosnia and Croatia, Catholicism is designated as a problem because it plays a role of identity marker for the Croatian nationality. Many commentators argued Bosnian and Croatian Catholicism did not play the roles of peacemakers in recent wars because they were not religion, but ultimately nationalisms. As such, that they reinforced the nationalist calls to arms or weakly resisted them. In all three cases I mentioned, Bosnian, Croatian, and Polish, the collectivism of Catholicism is considered as synonymous with and ultimately epiphenomenal to nationalism. So the second argument against Catholicism that are linked to group identities stems from the view that whenever that link happens, Catholicism ceases to be a religious and becomes a political category. It becomes secularized. It loses depth, which makes it a religion. There is no doubt, of course, that the described criticisms of the link between Catholicism and group identities make a very valid point. The notion of religious nationalism correctly identifies one important phenomenon, the connection between religion and nationalism, through which Catholicism often adopts not just a modern, but also very secular vocabulary. Moreover, much can be said about the direct or indirect roles that group-oriented Catholicism played and still play in social conflicts and wars all over the world, from Ireland to Bosnia and Herzegovina. But it is also important to ask, does this straightforward picture, negative picture, of culturally and historically embedded Catholicisms also miss something? Is every group-oriented Catholicism intolerant and a problem for pluralistic democracies? Can every particularistic Catholicism be reduced to nationalism? Most importantly, are group-oriented Catholicisms less Catholicism because of that orientation? So I want to address these questions in three steps. First, I want to take a look at the dark side of Catholicism when they're embedded in historical context and associated with group identities. I will do so by considering two examples from the contemporary post-communist Polish and Bosnian context. The second step will be to complicate this picture. I want to look at the cases in which both Polish and Bosnian Catholic churches became the moral authority in their societies. The case is when Catholicism shaped a distinctly Catholic culture of solidarity that were good for democracy, public life, and reconciliation. Most importantly, in that second group that I want to consider, Catholicism acquired such positive meanings and roles because it was not just a universal community of salvation, but was particularly in character as well. Finally, in my conclusion, I want to argue that we need to move beyond the notion of religious nationalism, which assumes and explains every group-oriented Catholicism as a secularized cultural phenomenon and nothing but a channel for nationalism. This conceptual move is needed not only because collectivistic Catholicisms, as I call them, are here now and present us with serious challenges. Much more importantly, I think, we ought to develop new and nuanced ways to appreciate collectivistic Catholicisms because they may provide much needed resources for democracies today and much needed constructive critique of some of the aspects of late modern global world. So let me turn to the dark side of collectivistic Catholicism, and I'll start with Polish and then move to Bosnian case. In the last decades of communist regime in Poland, Adam Michnik, a secular Polish intellectual, journalist, and activist, wrote a very influential book, The Church and the Left. He argued here, in this book, he discarded the long history of anti-religiousness and anti-clericalism of the Polish secular left. Michnik recognized the manner in which the Catholic Church both accepted and contributed to modern democracy. And he argued that only the unified front of all anti-totalitarian forces, secular and Catholic, could break the communist oppression and lead the Polish society into democracy. Several decades later, however, in the post-communist Poland, Michnik was one among many observers, both Catholic and non-Catholic, who stood as outspoken critics of the totalitarian temptations and conservatism of Polish Catholicism. Michnik thus rejected the Church attempts to legislate morality. He rejected the Church's desire to influence the political process as a privileged institution. And he's especially critical of the Catholic radio station Radio Maria. The station was founded by Father Tadeusz Rivier in 1993. It quickly became a success story in the post-communist Poland due to its remarkable fundraising abilities and many followers. The big part of the program of Radio Maria is religious. It consists of prayers and Catholic hymns. But the program also directly promotes conservative political parties. And even more, it came to be known for its anti-Semitism. For Father Rizik, for example, the European Union is a conspiracy of Freemasons. For another commentator of the Radio Maria, the Holocaust industry wields influence worldwide. The criticism of Rizik and the station arrived as expected from the secular left and liberal Catholics. The Polish church hierarchy and Pope Benedict XVI also voiced their disapproval of Father Rizik's use of Catholicism for his narrow political purposes. Even the Polish Pope, John Paul II, disapproved of the radio's radical Catholicism, its anti-European orientation, and anti-Semitic stance. In 2002, Cardinal Joseph Glenn, the main figure of the Polish Catholic Church, banned the offices of the radio station from operating in Warsaw and restricted its fundraising activities. Yet, nobody seemed to have been able to do much about it, or about Father Rizik's open use of religion for politics. According to some interpretations, even those Polish churchmen who oppose this radio and Father Rizik, they're afraid to act against him because of his power and the zealous support of his followers. It thus happens that at the beginning of the 21st century, Radio Maria, which for so many does nothing but promotes the most radical, intolerant concoction of Polish nationalism and Catholicism, is among the most influential radio stations with 10 to 15% of the polls, which means more than 4 million people, who listen to its program regularly and many who financially support it. Let me now move to the south of Europe, more south, the Bosnian story, which also seems to confirm the dangers of the dangers of any Catholic nationalist alliance for Catholicism itself. Let me take you to Medjugorje, the apparition site of the Virgin Mary, the Lady of Peace, her message about prayer, rosary, fasting, and love for humanity. This place of pilgrimage is also the place where we find the Medjugorje Peace Center. It is led by the Herzegovinian friars. And what may surprise many Catholics in the world, these Franciscans, Herzegovinian Franciscans, and the Mystic believers, think of the Virgin Mary, not only in terms of universality. She is also for them the Queen of the Croats. Kraljica Hrvata, it's the title that she has. To be sure, the particularistic meaning of the Medjugorje apparitions is not exceptional when compared to other pilgrim sites. Mary speaks Croatian in Medjugorje, Polish in Czestochowa, French in Lourdes. But Medjugorje has always been shaped by other historical and political variables. Firstly, it's not very much known that when Medjugorje apparitions began in 1981, this happened only days after the Orthodox Christian Serbs in this region had commemorated the 40th anniversary of the killings of their women and children by the Catholic Croats during World War II. Secondly, the initial narrative of the Catholic Croats in Medjugorje was that the Virgin Mary appeared to them to support their struggle against communism. In 1990s, however, there was another layer to this narrative, according to which Croatian independence was a gift from the Virgin Mary. The fact that the Republic of Croatia declared its independence on June 25, 1991, the 10th anniversary of the first Mary's apparition in Medjugorje, cemented in the popular imagination the connection among the pilgrim site, religious miracle ascribed to it, and the Croatian national struggle. So over the years, Medjugorje and Mary acquired two particularistic meanings, anti-communist and Croatian nationalist. The Herzegovinian friars were at the forefront of articulating such narratives. Of course, there were among them people like Father Jozo Zovko, who stated the fighting in Bosnia was a political conflict, not a religious war. But he also declared from the Medjugorje pulpit that Mary is, as he put it, calling upon her people to pick up their swords, put on their uniforms, and stop the power of Satan. The provincial of the Herzegovinian Franciscans argued that the Bosnian Muslims were organizing an Islamic state. Another Franciscan linked the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina to Turkish occupiers. In the narratives I described, theological and political were inseparable. The 20th century events merged with the 15th century Ottoman conquest. In such context, the crosses on display in schools and hospitals or on the hills above Herzegovinian towns, these crosses cannot be seen just as Christian symbols. Standing next to the Croatian national flags, the crosses also indicate territorial and national claims. They are erected as a boundary marker and as a signal to the non-Catholic others, Orthodox Christians and Muslims, that this is not their land. So far, I basically confirmed the arguments against the link between Catholicism and group identities, national in particular. Now, let me turn to a very different phase of both the Polish and Bosnian Catholicisms. Let us go back some 30 years in 1979, when Poland was still under communist regime, and the newly elected Pope John Paul II came to his homeland and was greeted by the millions of Poles. In 32 sermons that the Pope gave during his 9-day visit, he did not speak of politics. He spoke of human rights, religious freedom, and human dignity. The Poles responded to their Pope with hymns and prayers. They carried crosses, they sang hymns, waved flags. They shouted, "We want God," as the communists looked and couldn't do anything about it. It was this moment, as a number of historians later asserted, that started the anti-communist revolution. The moment in which the Polish Pope spoke of hope and the revolution of the spirit. And indeed, what followed in Poland was not just the political, but the moral revolution, which gave rise to a powerful social movement, Solidarność, or the Solidarity, as it became known in English. This social movement, deeply Catholic in its platform and symbolism, was led by workers whose protests against communists were accompanied by common prayers. The movement was also unique because it brought together Catholic churchmen, Catholic intellectuals, and secular intellectuals from the left, despite their ontological disagreements. The story of John Paul II, Solidarity and the fall of communism, of course, is very well known. But what does need more unpacking is the manner in which the universalistic and humanistic rhetoric of John Paul II was inseparable from his affirmation of the distinctiveness of Polish Catholicism. Its stubborn and courageous opposition to Marxist atheism, its loyalty to Rome, its history of being the defender of faith at the borders of the Catholic world. the image of Poland at the frontier as the bulwark of Christianity. When the Pope spoke of dignity, he used theological concepts, but he also placed his ideas of dignity of human person in the Polish history. When the Poles came to welcome the Pope and pray with him, they carried crosses next to the Polish national flags. It is possible to argue that in the concluding decades of the 20th century, the identity that has so often been criticized for its exclusive, intolerant character, the Polak Catholic identity, the church that embodied it, these were the agents of democracy and human rights. The moral authority of the Catholic Church was such that even the Marxist philosopher Leszek Kolakowski saw it as the force of social consciousness that resisted the Sovietization process. Similar to the Polish case, Bosnian Catholicism cannot be understood only and exclusively through the phenomenology of religious nationalism. Because next to the Herzegovinian friars that I spoke about, next to Medjugorje, there is another Franciscan institution of the Catholic Church, the Franciscan Province of Bosnia. Its members have been affirming the ideals of a multi-religious and multinational Bosnian society throughout the war. Unlike their Herzegovinian counterparts, Bosnian Franciscans became widely known for their peacemaking activities. This was not only because of their practical involvement or leadership in the humanitarian, economic, cultural, and political projects that had a goal of alleviating the consequences of the war. The Bosnian Franciscan peacemaking role was, I would argue, more radical in nature. And I have time to mention here only two examples. At the very beginning of the conflicts, Bosnian Franciscan Marko Ošović was one of the founders of the Interreligious and Intercultural Center Together. This organization emphasized the peaceful role of religion in society, and among other activities assisted people from religiously and nationally mixed marriages, which is a phenomenon very particular and particularly present in Sarajevo. Another Franciscan, I will not list the activities he's done, but I will just say that he received the Peace Activist Award from the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. It was presented to him for his, the explanation said, extraordinary heroism in helping refugees escape across enemy lines, bringing medicines and essential supplies across those same lines, as well as his continuing efforts to promote interreligious dialogue. In 1994, the contents and the force behind the positive role of the Bosnian Franciscans during and after the end of the war in Bosnia stemmed from what they recognized as the universal values of their Catholic faith, especially their view of Christology as a source of toleration. But the radical character of the Franciscans in peacemaking would not have been possible without their strong conviction that their Catholic identity is also deeply Bosnian in character. In 1994, as the conflicts in Bosnia were still going on, the Bosnian friars declared, "We can realize our religious, cultural, national, and political identities first and foremost in dialogue with the members of other nations, religions, and cultures. The more we affirm the difference in Bosnia, the more we affirm its unity." Within this Franciscan view, being Catholic and being Croatian also means being Bosnian. Here, the national and the religious exist next to each other without abolishing each other, or those who are different. So what are we to make out of this? How to account for the complex meanings of Catholicism when they shape or are related to group identities? We saw that group-oriented Catholicism have been source of intolerance and conflict, but they have also been open to their religious others. In some instances, they have been the obstacle of reconciliation, but in others, Catholicism linked to national identities were the impetus of radical social changes. They were the carriers of democracy. Indeed, why is the group-oriented Catholicism of the Bosnian Franciscans so different from the Herzegovinian Franciscans? How can we explain two phases of Polish Catholicism that came to be expressed in the course of only 2 decades? First structural variable that may be helpful in understanding these complexities is the relationship between the Catholic Church and the nation-state. Many indicators suggest that today, public authority of the Polish Catholic Church is weakening among the Polish Catholics. Church moral leadership, however, was undisputed in the times when it was most oppressed and it had absolutely no privileges, when in fact it was among the main critics of the state. Likewise, the Herzegovinian friars were very influential in the processes in which the Croatian nationalists attempted to divide Bosnia by creating an independent Croatian entity during Bosnian War. Bosnian Franciscans, for their part, never aligned themselves with any political faction or the state. Put simply, we can see that the greater proximity of the Catholic Church and its representatives to some form of nation-state, the greater is the danger, not only for the Church, but also for the universal tenets of Catholicism. On the other hand, there is a more conceptual reading of this complicated picture of group-oriented Catholicism. This reading supports Emil Durkheim's old but elegant analytic point. The sources of collective effervescence create boundaries that lead not only to conflict, but also to socially beneficial solidarity. Which means Catholicism that is linked to group identity may be the source of exclusion and conflict, but it can also be a powerful force of integration. Where does this leave us? It leaves us at the point where I think we should not a priori dismiss group-oriented Catholicisms as incompatible with democratic sensibilities or as incompatible with Catholic faith. What is needed is the retrieval of political, philosophical, and institutional conditions conducive to group-oriented Catholicisms that shape more virtuous ways of belonging. Belonging that enables individuals to affirm both difference from and tolerance of the other. To do this, it is essential to be able to consider Catholicisms and group identities in a way that will avoid what philosopher Charles Taylor calls the subtraction stories of religion in the modern world. In such stories, the linked religion collective identity is presented as the secularization of religion and as a problem for contemporary pluralism. The concept that really embodies such subtraction story is the notion of religious nationalism. Whenever I encounter this concept in the study of Catholicism, the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church were presented as the property of the political sphere of life, and their complex institutional, cultural, and theological histories were condensed into a history of nationalism. And I'm almost done. So what I want to propose is a little bit different way to think about the link between Catholicism and group identities. And that is the notion of collectivistic Catholicism. I think that this notion actually can help us to think of Catholicism that are culturally specific, historically embedded, public, and defined in part by the presence of religious other, or non-religious other. Collectivistic Catholicism shape identities that separate their members from other religious groups, and one does not choose to belong to them. One is born into them. I think this is a useful tool for several reasons. First, it allows us for a more charitable view of group-oriented Catholicisms. It does not approach them as a priori negative phenomenon. It conceptualizes them rather as expressions of the universal human desire to belong, and as historical manifestations of even the most universalistic religious traditions. Second, the notion of collectivistic Catholicism helps us to recover public and historically embedded Catholicisms from their epiphenomenal status with regard to nationalism. It enables us, and this is really important, to distinguish between the problems and the potential that such collectivistic Catholicisms bring in the public arena of pluralistic societies. So there are different ways in which we can think about the contributions that these Catholicisms can make. Echoing sociologist Jose Casanova's work on public religions, we can envision how these collectivistic Catholicisms, precisely because they are public, precisely because they emphasize tradition and affirm ascription and group boundaries, how such collectivistic Catholicism may in fact provide a normative critique of economic institutions when these institutions engage the borderless global world as it relentlessly pursues profit while neglecting questions of social justice at home. Second, in the present moment when the Catholic Church representatives from Croatia to Ireland, from Poland to Bosnia, are debating the contents and institutional applications of secularity, collectivistic Catholicism may provide a useful counterpoint to the liberal politics of secularism. They may, in other words, serve as one of the resources that sociologist Nilofer Golay recognizes as constitutive of modernity's capacity for continual self-correction. Third, as we learn that the individualization of religions sometimes actually include public indifference to politics and low water turnout, and can even become an obstacle for the processes of reconciliation in societies such as Northern Ireland. Catholicisms here emerge not as a problem for pluralistic democracies. They become a resource for the engagement of citizens in democratic politics, especially in post-conflict situations. And I think we saw some of the potential in the Boston context. And finally, if nationalism should not be dismissed in the global world because it is a powerful particularistic source of social solidarity for every individual, the same, I believe, can be said for collectivistic Catholicisms. In an age that is characterized by a re-enchantment and religious pluralism, collectivistic Catholicisms emerge not as an obstacle to freedom of the individual, not as an obstacle for Catholic faith, but as a promise of the individual's belonging to a particular community in the world that, in the words of one social theorist, is the world inhabited by strangers. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I'm just curious on both of your perspectives on how the digital age and digital communications will actually impact national regions or identities in that.
You want to
Well, until you can digitally celebrate the Eucharist, and I'm saying that without being flippant, there are really, to me, really strict limits to how much Catholic identity can become entirely digital. I think that the Catholicity of the Church is becoming much more apparent. We hear much more quickly about a raid, a terrorist attack on a Catholic church in Baghdad than we might have before it. We hear much more quickly about occasions to provide solidarity. I think we also have much more information about our faith, the average Catholic, which I think ever since Vatican II has been sort of the great challenge, right? How to get the laity involved in carrying its burden in the church. And so I think there the digital age is providing much more assistance.
If I can ask a clarification, did you ask whether these new technologies are going to do something different or they're going to transform national boundaries or borders? How did you ask? Can you say the question again?
Yeah, in previous research that I've been working on, observing how digital identities are replacing a nationalistic perspective.
Regional identities.
Regional identities. I'm just curious as to whether that will help just increase solidarity or how that may just impact this national Catholic identity itself.
So I don't know anything about what technologies are doing, what digital age is doing for that, but I can say that I think that what's happening at the moment, on the one hand, generally speaking, there is a tendency to think about the world as a global world, very much interconnected. But then there is another side of the whole process, which is fragmentation. So you mentioned regional identities. I think technologies like digital technologies, I think they can help either. And I think they can be used for different purposes. So I know that this is not an answer perhaps that you were expecting, but I think that they can be used for the purposes that those who are using them actually have. I think technology is net neutral in that sense, right?
Bill?
Just a quick rejoinder to that too. The one role that those technologies play is in holding together diasporas. Mm-hmm. So regional identities, they're attenuated a bit, but they spread beyond the region. You know, the people continue to identify with their region. Thank you, Martin, for your presentation. I'm very interested in that. Full disclosure, my father-in-law is from Schlesien. Grew up in that area, I think, before being displaced to Berlin. It's very interesting, and he's part of that Catholic milieu as well, I guess. I'm very interested to hear about this. I have a couple of interrelated questions about your presentation. One of them is about this idea of the Occident, or the Abendland. I've felt like I've never had a handle on that concept itself, and one of the reasons, evidently, from what you said, is that it's a slippery concept, and you point us to the ways in which different people drew the boundaries of the Abendland differently, and yet it seems that while it was clear from the get-go that the French would have been included, there was some sort of strong prejudice against including Russians, first of all, but by implication any Slavic peoples. And I guess my question is, where does this, there's kind of Orientalism at work here. Where does that come from? If you trace that at all back a bit, why was it that the boundary excluded Slavic people? That's the first question. The second one is a bit more specific to your thesis. It's simply that from what you've said, your view seems to be that it was this kind of prejudice against Slavs that accounted for the different results with the Catholic Germans in the East and the West. But it also sounds like it might have made a difference in the narrative you give us that you had a very powerful local state government, Prussian government in the East, whereas you didn't have the same kind of thing. There was maybe a bit of a vacuum. I don't know how well the governments were in that region, but it sounds like part of the dynamic was driven by antipathy toward the Prussian Protestant state there. I wonder how much you think that the politics there, as opposed to the ethnic prejudices, played a role.
Well, let me take them in order. The question of the origin of Occidental thinking in the 20th century, I think, is really interesting because it's not quite clear yet. You already have, during the war, you have virtually nothing before the war. Before the war, you have a ton of very quiet, very effective economic interlinkages and cooperation between German, French, and Luxembourg and Belgium in heavy industry. That really doesn't even disappear during the war. But in terms of idealism, I think that's largely a post-World War I phenomenon. You see a little bit of it during the war. Hochland, which is a conservative German journal, publishes an article in 1917 in which a German officer attends Pentecost Vespers in the Cathedral of Tournai. And he says, here I am in my German uniform, and here are these Belgians, and we probably, under any normal conditions, would kill each other. But here we are attending to the same Holy Spirit that should be uniting us, and somehow it's not. What's wrong here? So I think there's a beginning of that. There's a talk about Gothic architecture as uniting, things like that already during the war. There also is, during the war, already a talk about how Germany is fighting against French laicism. We're fighting to re-Christianize Europe. That France took a wrong turn in the French Revolution, and we're going to undo it when we win. And then they have to quickly reorient themselves when not only does France win, but Germany falls apart, supposedly, in the Revolution of 1819. So for me, it's not quite clear exactly where. I think Platz, as this womanist, plays a huge role in developing that idea. What I think for me, the second question is that I'm also still not quite clear about is, what is the balance between pragmatism and idealism? Are we looking for simply some sort of language, some sort of concept that will allow us to move out of the stalemate we're in? Or are we truly looking for a European future that will not only prevent the horrors of war, but will also be a new Christianity? Frankly, I think it's both, but it's not real clear where the weights are.
Was Europe, when you say that, constructed as coextensive with the Abendland, and so the Slavs didn't belong to Europe in this?
I don't. That's the second question, right? That's part of that question. I don't think for them, the Poles, maybe the Bohemians, but definitely the Poles, the Hungarians, and points further east, with the possible exception of the Baltikum, are not part of the European story at all. It ends, at Germany's eastern frontier, and then the Austro-Hungarian frontier as well. It's very much a Western, Latin, right, Christianity around a Catholicity that is Western rather than Central European.
Is one way of judging whether, or how pragmatic it was and how kind of deeply rooted it was, is one way of measuring that, just to see what happens to it once the Nazis take over. I mean, does this does it persist, or does it just disappear in a kind of nationalist fervor once the...
It does persist as the really weak flowers of any kind of German Polish cooperation. There are lots of Germans who are still very much interested in French literature, French culture, French theology in the 30s. I think in part as a way of escaping what's being written at home. Let's read foreign stuff because it's better. But what I think is more interesting is the wartime resumption of talks in Switzerland, and then the Nouvelle Équipe, the forerunner of a Christian democratic European organization that already invites the Germans in even before the war has ended, and Adenauer and others are really active. And then right after the war, you see Germans saying, this is the way we're going to get back into the family of nations. And now we also have, by the way, this Bolshevik threat, which I think also plays a role in 1919 already. That Poland is seen as threatened as somehow as Bolshevik.
Does any of this apply to Bavaria? I mean, you've been talking about these two, or is Bavaria just a whole other case?
Bavaria is, I think, in the 20s, is still trying to figure out how much it wants to be part of this Germany. And I mean that sincerely. I think that the Bavarians are fighting until the late 20s for greater regional autonomy, for greater self-government against the national government. And they don't see much difference. They've got their own Catholic party, the Bavarian People's Party. They're not part of the center. They have their own bishops' conference. They're not part of the German bishops' conference, although Faulhaber starts attending the Fulda bishops' conference meetings. They coordinate in some things, but the Bavarians are still very much focused on autonomy and, in fact, argue in 33 that it might be a great idea to bring back the Wittelsbach dynasty as a way of avoiding going Nazi.
So the Nuremberg and the whole kind of the reputation that the Bavarians have for being kind of enthusiastic.
Well, they would tell you that Nuremberg is Frankish, Franconian.
Okay.
It's Protestant, and that they're not really Bavarians up there.
Okay.
You know, it's this bizarre, and the Franconians insist very much that they're not Bavarians.
So this is region inside the region.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so this is not just a sort of post-war saying we weren't really Nazis at all.
In fact, if you look at the map, there are definitely parts of true Bavaria, I would say, where the Nazis do well, but there are large parts where they do not do well through the March 33 elections.
Okay.
Your question about Rhenish and just really quick, your Rhenish and Silesian government. I think there is that. But the Rhinelanders have been also under Prussian control since the end of the Napoleonic Empire. But the Rhineland, and they've suffered much more under the anti-Catholicism of the Prussian government in the 19th century. But they're much better organized, and they're wealthier. Upper Silesian Catholics are generally poor. Lower Silesian Protestants, so Breslau, the capital of the province, is in Lower Silesia. That's rich. That's part of Germany's granary. Upper Silesia it's mining, it's small industry. They're poor. They have very weak organization. There is a class difference because the nobles who owned most of the big estates in the region don't actually want their quote unquote their farmers voting for these new democratic parties. That's part of it.
Karen?
A question for Slava about the pilgrimage to Medjugorje and sort of appropriation of Mary on the side of nationalism of the sort of nasty side by one group of Franciscans. I'm wondering that the other group of Franciscans then promote a different vision of the pilgrimage to Medjugorje and Our Lady, a different Marian theology. And what would, if that's the case, what would account for the differences between these two groups in their interpretation of that event and the pilgrimage?
The question of jurisdiction is a big one there. It's a very political question. It's also a question of whether it should be the Herzegovinian Franciscans who actually control it, or the bishops, right? Or the bishop, the local bishop.
Right.
So I cannot even envision the possibility the Bosnian Franciscan could actually influence at all how this place is run. I mean, because the jurisdictions have been historically divided, and for 500 years, Bosnian Franciscans had their own side, and then when Herzegovinian Franciscans emerged, this is a local story, right? But what would it count theologically for the difference should it happen? between the Bosnian Franciscans and Herzegovinian Franciscans. I would think that one possibility could be, because in Bosnia proper, what is also present is the appropriation of Mary by the Muslims, right? I could imagine that it could be even more universalist, more open, right? Not just to Christians, not just to Catholics, not just to Christians, but actually everybody who lives there. That would be one venue. But it's very hard for me to envision because of the jurisdiction issues, really.
So the other group of Franciscans
Yes.
did not come out and say we are
They
we're
comment
open-minded in
Okay.
our particularity,
Okay, that's a
the
very-
universal dimension of things.
Yeah.
And so we have a different view of Mary than
Okay.
those other Franciscans do.
Yeah, that's a very good question in terms of the ways in which different anniversaries, celebrations have been addressed in, say, Bosnian Franciscan magazine, of the Franciscans, the ones who are less particularistic, less nationalistic. They do actually condemn the nationalism of the pilgrim site. They do condemn and they think it's an appropriation for political purposes. So that's very, very explicit. But as far as theology goes, that's a part that I can't envision.
Other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to put this, but it's around the notion that Professor Jakelic suggested towards the end about a kind of affirmation of the neo-Durkheimian notion of collective solidarity.
Charles Taylor's.
To use a Charles Taylorism. This neo-Durkheimianism in which you would affirm a kind of collective group identity, solidarity, even in Durkheim's terms, a collective ecstasy. And in both of your accounts, you have different ways of conceiving group identity, and that Catholicism in both contexts is a group identity. And whose collective ecstasy, if I can put it that way, governs whose collective ecstasy? That is, you have group identities in conversation, and who's got the higher ecstasy, as it were, and whose ecstasy is being drawn up into the others?
This is an excellent question, and I really actually heard Martin's paper today because he talked about regional identities.
Yes.
And the way I conceptualize identity, I think one of the biggest problems in the study of religion and collective identity is that collective identity is by majority of people who think about these issues identifies as nationalism. Collective identity is not nationalism. Collective identity can be constituted of numerous things, including religion, including nationalism, including ethnicity, including race, region, language, gender even, and depending on different contexts, the relationships can play out in different ways. So I think that the answer to your question, so that's a conceptual part of the answer. The empirical or more historical sociological part of the answer is that in order to figure out what is actually happening in certain moments of collective effervescence, although, as Durkheim would say, these kinds of affirmations of identity don't have to be played out in a very enthusiastic, ecstatic way. They can be played out in very ritualistic ways, rituals that are national and that happen regularly.
Well, all
right?
ritual is ecstatic, though.
I don't agree with that, but that's
Okay.
okay. Okay, so, but what I wanted to say, let me think where I stopped. I think that the answer to the question of what's the relationship among these different aspects of collective identity is a very empirical one. And I think we can never know before entering the situation actually how they're related, how they play out. It depends very much on the context. It depends. Italian can say that he's from this region in Italy or in Europe, but when he comes to America, he's Italian, right? So it depends on where we are, it depends on who we're talking to, and I think we emphasize different sides of who we are depending on the audience, right? So that's my point.
I think the response I could give to that is that the regions there isn't this dominance because the regions don't interact as much. In other words, where it gets interesting is, for example, after the war, when the Silesian and Amland expellees arrive in some of the really sober northern German Catholic dioceses, and their piety, their hymnody, everything is just so alien to the local Catholics there that it's almost as if you're talking about two different religions. Similarly, for example, in the Rhineland, Catholics engage in carnival. Bavarians don't. Saxons don't. right? And so I think that there really isn't a national German Catholic tradition. On the other hand, the currently valid hymnal for Germany is actually a hymnal for the German-speaking dioceses of Germany, Austria, Liège, and Bozen-Brixen in South Tyrol. So their national boundaries I've already been dissipated, but the national hymnal still has a diocesan appendix. And without being as familiar with the concepts you're addressing, my sense is that there is no dominance of any one of these traditions and groups against the other.
Let me give it a more liturgical
Okay.
frame. That my question really is the Eucharist absorbing, or is the Eucharist in a sense absorbing the regional cultural group identities, or are the cultural and regional identities absorbing up the Eucharist into its greater collective ecstasis?
I think within Germany, they would acknowledge, and with the French, they would acknowledge that the Eucharist absorbs the national identity. With the Poles, I'm not so sure they would consider the sacraments valid. That's the great oddity there.
They're Slavs.
They're Slavs, yeah.
Well, it's an interesting kind of a question, even about the whole kind of the valorization of kind of a Durkheimian notion of, reintegration and so on. I mean, even to the extent that that's meant as sort of a benevolent embrace and a sort of allowing religiosity a more fulsome part of the process. It's sometimes kind of maybe whether to what extent that itself is an instrumentalization of religious communities, traditions, and so on. I happen to be reading a book by another guy who quoted one of John Paul's homilies from the first papal visit to Warsaw, and again, you read it 20 years, 30 years later, it's almost like a down payment on some of these other problems. He's talking, John Paul says, I greet with veneration the nest of the pious, the legendary first Polish dynasty, the origin of the history of our motherland and the cradle of the church. Altogether, we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people he claims for his own. Altogether, we also form the royal race of the pious. And it's, wow, that's the language of 1 Peter to describe the church. Yeah. To have them merge so seamlessly and organically.
Well, this is how Machiavelli ends The Prince, right? Italy is the new Corpus Christi, the new body of Christ.
That's right. Interesting. So, yeah.
But Italy didn't exist
Well, I mean,
as a nation.
yes. Fair enough.
It's region. It's or rather states, right?
It's not a state.
But Machiavelli
The difference
foresaw
is
the
he
unity of
wanted-
Italy.
he
He
wanted-
wanted the unity of
yes,
Italy.
yes.
He wanted the unity of all the city-states.
Where it gets interesting is after 45, much more interesting than the relations between, for example, German-speaking clergy and Polish government authorities are the relations between German clergy and the new Polish hierarchies. So, for example, you have, the Polish clergy want these Germans out of there as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the Polish authorities are saying, well, until the last ethnic German is gone, they're going to need clergy. But, try to talk about incarnation, talk about access to fees, the right to use vehicles to get from parish to parish. All of this is much more nasty, if you will, among the clergy than it is between even the new communist authorities and the German Catholics.
Any concluding reflections or thoughts you want to share? Last question for anyone in the back?
Just real quick, what you mentioned in this very intriguing and pregnant notion of collectivistic these Catholicisms could define themselves dialectically in relation to secular
And non-secular.
and non-secular religion. So does it make a difference if the others against which these Catholicisms define themselves are religious or not?
Does it make difference for Catholicism, or does it make
For Catholicism, yeah.
I think it does. I think it may. But it's a fascinating thing in the Polish context how the same narrative about The Poles, by the way, use the same narrative of being the bulwark of Christianity as the Croats do, in different periods for different reasons. So in the Polish context, the bulwark of Christianity has been used from sort of Middle Ages for the Ottomans, for the Russians, and for the Russians later on as Russians as Orthodox Christians, but also Russians as communists. So, so the different types of narratives can have different meanings in different contexts. But for the what would change about Catholicism itself? In what sense, I would ask? I think there, in terms of cultural expressions or manifestations, in terms of whether it's public, I think that in the ways in which I'm interested, which is Catholicism as a public religion, and Catholicism as something that is contributing to shaping sense of belonging. I don't think much would change about that. But maybe you don't have a
All right, good. We'll see.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to our guests.